They say colonialism ended after world wars, but for Palestine it began with one, and with a letter barely a paragraph long signed by a man who didn't live in the land addressed to another who didn't live there either, promising it to a people who weren't from there. It didn't describe olive trees bulldozed or families forced into exile. It didn't mention refugee camps, apartheid walls, or drones above Gaza, just 67 words, that's all it took. A British promise, not to the people of the land, but to outsiders in exchange for power during war. The world was bleeding. World War One set Europe on fire. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Britain was stretched thin, desperate for allies and influence. And Palestine, it wasn't a war zone. It wasn't Zionist territory. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. Muslims, Jews, Christians, they all lived side by side. 90% or more of the population were Arab Palestinians. Less than 10% of them were Jewish. And the Jewish people, most of them were native Arab-speaking and opposed to Zionism. But in London, that didn't matter. Because behind closed doors, Britain was negotiating away a land it didn't even control. They didn't need maps, they just needed a deal, and they were about to sign one that would rip history in half. Here's how it started. The British Empire, bleeding through war, turned to the Zionist movement for help, and the Zionist leaders, particularly in Britain and America, saw an opportunity. They offered influence, access to Jewish media power, banking networks, political leverage in the US. And in return, they asked for a homeland in someone else's land. Chaim Weizmann wasn't just a chemist, he was a broker of empires. He pitched the idea Jewish support in America could tip the war in Britain's favor. Naturally, Britain bought it. And to seal the deal, Arthur Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, sat down and wrote that infamous letter. He didn't write it to the people of Palestine, not to its Muslims, not to its Christians. He addressed it to Lord Walter Rothschild, a banker, a Zionist aristocrat, a man with no ties to the land he was being handed. That's how Palestine got promised to someone who had no right to it. The letter said, His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. Then, just to make it sound balanced, they tacked on, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But even that clause was a lie. The last sentence in the Balfour Declaration, the one that sounds like it's protecting Palestinians, it's colonial PR. Because in British secret documents uncovered years later, one line stood out like a wound. It was never intended that the Arabs should be consulted. The promise was fake. The protection was fake. The whole thing was smoke. This wasn't about creating peace. It was about buying loyalty, and the price was Palestinian land. Once the letter was sent, the machine started moving. After the war ended, Britain didn't walk away from Palestine. They occupied it. They called it the Mandate, backed by the League of Nations, but it was imperial control. Under that mandate, Britain opened the gates. European Zionist settlers poured in, not just to escape persecution, but to colonize. And while that happened, Britain armed them. Settlements were built, roads laid, Palestinian villages pushed out, protests crushed, resistance criminalized. Zionist militias began forming, the Irgun, Haganah, Lehi, and Britain looked the other way. They were building a future state, and Britain was helping them do it. All under the excuse, we promised them this land. Who were they to promise the land? Let's go back to that civil rights clause, the one that said nothing would prejudice the rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Sounds fair, right? But ask yourself, what are civil rights when someone else is given your country? What are religious rights when your mosque is torn down? What does protection mean when you're jailed for trying to stay in your own home? In 1939, a secret British memo came out and it said plainly, it was inserted for public opinion. We never intended to enforce it. They knew from the beginning this would spark revolt. They knew Palestinians would rise up. They knew resistance would come. And they prepared, not by honoring the people, but by targeting them. It wasn't law, it was strategy. They built a system where the native population became criminals just for existing. They weren't trying to protect the peace. They were preparing to control the fallout of a theft. And that theft, it was already being written in policy, law, and concrete. The Balfour Declaration wasn't just a letter. It was the first domino, a quiet explosion on paper that triggered generations of violence, war, and erasure. Every bombing in Gaza, every refugee denied return, every checkpoint, every stolen home, every child buried under rubble. All of it traces back to that letter, that moment, those 67 words. It taught the world something brutal. If you're powerful enough, you can give away land you don't own to people who don't live there at the cost of those who do. This wasn't written in peace, it wasn't born from justice, it came from desperation, from racism, from empire. It was never a promise, it was never diplomacy, it was a theft, and it was only the beginning.